RV Carmel by the Sea with Eric Clapton and Derek and the Dominoes.
It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
For those of you that take the regular tapes by subscription or it's played on other stations, the program will begin in about 10 seconds. There was a time lapse here because Michael, who does the arrangements in KLRB, wasn't there tonight, and another person was at the station, so the switchboard wasn't working as it should. So I'll sign off now, and the regular tape will begin in about 1 second. Over the...
I gotcha.
You got me?
Yeah.
We're on the air, right? Little trouble in the control room this evening. Michael isn't here, so we'll continue at this point. Everything okay?
Yeah, we're okay.
We're okay. I'll start over. It's tape number 458, in case you didn't get it. On the air at September 14th, 1980. Sorry for the mix-up here. Michael's in San Jose on Sunday evening. I'm used to him handling the switchboard, but we'll get off okay. I apologize. I didn't get to the meeting of Amnesty International last week. I announced that there was a meeting here at Monterey Peninsula College on Tuesday evening, and for reasons that I will explain to you next week, I'm not at liberty to explain right now. I couldn't get to the meeting. I wanted to, and many people went. I'm interested in the organization, and if there is a chapter on the peninsula, I will attend. I'm usually not tied up in the evenings if I say I'll be there, but circumstances came up that I couldn't make it. I did want to mention one problem that I had coming back from Los Angeles a week and a half ago. I wasn't going to mention it on the air, but I did make 2 tape cassettes about a year ago that subscribers got on different incidences that had happened to our family. I'm always asked the question on the telephone, on radio stations, are you in danger, or do you think the kind of work you're doing is dangerous? That comes up very often. So I did 2 hours of various things that had happened to me and my family a while back. But last week, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I was in Los Angeles, and it was a warm summer evening, and I was at home with the windows wide open. About 3 in the morning, a car pulled up, and I jumped up, and I heard somebody run down the driveway. The bedroom that I had was in the front of the house. And there's a long driveway at the back. My car was parked in the back in the driveway, and I heard someone run down the driveway, and I didn't think it was neighbors. The neighbors didn't come in their car, and I heard them run back and get into the car. And I should have gone downstairs as fast as I could to see what was going on, but I don't like to be paranoid, and I don't know what I thought, but that's what I heard. So that next morning we were leaving to drive back up to Carmel, and I made up my mind I would go very slow and not that 60 or 70 plus miles an hour. I like to tear up Highway 101 coming home, and was going very slowly, and outside of San Luis Obispo, about 45 miles, there was a flare on the road, and a trailer turned over, and we were forced to go slow and almost to stop, and then just crawl along. The cars were crawling, and we smelled this burning, and we thought the flares smelled because the windows were open. And when the cars picked up speed and the trailer situation was cleared up, instead of escalating, I pulled to the side of the road, and by then my car was smoking and rose to the hood, and it was very bad condition. And I turned the key, and there was no engine. And we had to be towed into San Luis Obispo about 40 miles and stay there overnight. And the next morning it was in the shop, and the water hose evidently had been cut, the line of water to the engine didn't get to the engine, and the engine completely burned out. And I had to get another car, bought a used car, and came on home. I didn't really rent a car, whatever. I mean, the mechanics of replacing the burned out car aren't important. The point was that I should have jumped up to try to see what was happening. And the people at the car agency explained that it was burned. And when I came home, I went to the garage that's taken care of the car ever since I got it. And to one other agency described the situation. They thought it would be almost impossible unless the water hose was cut in some way, and it didn't register on the dashboard. I just mentioned that in case anything comes up in the future. You add these things are cumulative, and I don't know. We'll never know what happened, but if I had been going very fast, the speed I usually go, it might have been pretty dangerous. But as a safety, as a precaution, or whatever, I feel better sharing these with you, these instances, as they happen, because sometimes they come in bunches, and then the pressure's off for a while before something else comes up. Now to the news. I'm going to digress from Ronald Reagan and get back to Ronald Reagan, but as a sideline of Reagan, to make a transition to Jimmy Carter, I want to go into a very complicated subject that in 55 minutes, it's difficult to describe to people who haven't thought of it in these terms, and this is the situation of narcotic war that is going on at this time. We hear a lot of the candidates talking about their political opinions, what they would do with the military, what they would do with the economy, and so forth. But there's very little said about the organizations that they belong to that are directly linked to organized crime and how the turf is being divided between them and how the battle between the major candidates, the Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan team that never really lost power, the strong California, Florida, the Marseille connections, the Vietnam, the Golden Triangle, down there, not the Afghanistan, Turkey, Middle East arch of narcotics. The Southeast Asia narcotic combat increased with the Vietnam War and involvement in Southeast Asia involved not only Richard Nixon his entire career with links to organized crime and mafia, but those people who have also been the strong supporters of Ronald Reagan and his campaign ever since they decided to run him for governor and then for president of the United States. I have quoted several times before an article in U.S. News and World Report. It was published last year in 1979 that mafia-related activities gross a minimum of over $40 billion a year, totally not taxable. All of this money is from organized crime and stays in the hands of criminals that never do see jail. People like Meyer Lansky or Carlos Marcello maybe spend a few months in jail in their entire life, and that is all. They hire hitmen and mob lieutenants. Their salaries range from $75,000 to $165,000 a year. And U.S. News Report describes these crime figures as having more profit than General Motors, Exxon, and Sears Roebuck combined. And that is a lot of profit. But the economists that are on radio stations or send out their newsletters, and people watch the Rough Report or various reports on the economy, what to do with gold, what to do with silver and investments and interest rates, how to get the most for your money, never have articles on the effect, the very serious effect of organized crime on the economy, how it affects housing and retail stores and grocery stores or mom-and-pop stores or franchises, the rates of hotel rooms and resorts, and the prostitution, the effect of blackmail prostitution and forgery of documents and stealing of securities and so forth. This is a business. This is the most lucrative business in the United States. Next to it would come, I suppose, oil and weapons and then the medical industry. But no candidate ever addresses himself to organized crime or to the profits or what it does to our livelihood. So I want to talk about that complicated subject the best I can in this small amount of time. And, of course, in the past and the future, we'll be referring to this as the weeks go on and as I've done before on the other tapes. Just before I get into the subject of organized crime, I do want to mention last week I referred to a book on the suppressed poems of Robinson Jeffers. It's called In This Wild Water, and there are 12 poems that were deleted from one of the books that he published, The Double Axe, that Random House wouldn't publish. But there's one poem of these deleted, and I thought maybe I would read one a week, because I'm ornery, and when I don't want you to see them, I want you to see them. And there's a poem he wrote, Pourvu que ça dure, meaning provided that it lasts. And this poem is a symbol. It is very much in tune with what I feel about my research and the necessity to expose the kinds of things that are going on today and not pretend they don't exist. Robinson Jeffers said, "Life grows, life is not made. You make death. Neither were the sun nor the stars created, but grew from what grew before. Without the corruption of plants and corpses, life could not grow. Look around you at civilization decaying and sick. He wrote this in 1948 is when it was suppressed. Look at science corrupted to be death's bawd, and art, painting, and sculpture that had some dignity is corrupted in the show-off antics of an imbecile child, and statecraft into the democratic gestures of a gin-muddled butcher boy. Look all around you and praise the solitary hawk flights of God. He liked the hawk going off into the sunset, the symbolism of the bird and his freedom. And you can say, what a stinking of famous corpses to fertilize the fields of the human future, if man's back holds. That's the title of the poem, If Man's Back Holds. And what he tried to say is that the burden of corruption we have to bear in the future as we live and our life goes on, that we should look around us and see that things are corrupted, whether it's our science, this new DNA scandal, the cloning, or the inability to put radiation or the pay it off or spin off from using radioactive material. We don't know what to do with it. And buildings that have cancer-causing substances in them and ships and so forth. He says science and art and statecraft are made up of famous corpses that are stinking. And yet everything comes from what precedes it. And new forms evolve, and that if you don't acknowledge corruption, then the future will depend on the decaying and sick spin-off of science and so forth. He claimed that we misused science for our wars and for death, and that art is misused, and that statecraft is misused. And Robinson Jeffrey said, man has to bear the weight of this civilization if he wants to continue to live. He has to acknowledge those things about him and then get back to the relationship of man to his own nature. Charles Spears, who I have mentioned before on other tapes, who collects a chronology of events, was outraged as I was last week when NBC on the Today Show had Richard Nixon with a 3-part series as if he were an elder statement, dignified, and so forth. And Charles got out September the 8th after he saw that show, a section of his chronology and put it in letter form and sent it to public officials. And a few dates, I'll read you just about 12 dates of the Nixon administration in case you forgot it or don't remember back to 1968. Some of you do. He wrote a letter, April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King shot and killed. June the 4th, 1968, Robert Kennedy killed at the Ambassador Hotel to get Nixon elected. August 1968, the Chicago Democratic riots led by federal agent provocateurs. May the 9th, 1969, the bombing, in lieu of bombing Vietnam, Nixon and Kissinger start 6 years of bombing Cambodia to keep the B-52 fly boys happy. July 18th, 1969, Chappaquiddick set up by the Defense Department to eliminate the third Kennedy brother. May 1st, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover is deep sixed by the MKU toothbrush trick after Nixon asked him to resign. Deep six means to be put into his grave. The MKU is the chemical or the poison that got J. Edgar Hoover. And a few days later, May 15th, 1972, George Wallace shot for 20% of the conservative votes. November the 7th, 72, Nixon landslides into Congress as a president in his second term, rather. And December the 8th, 1972, Nixon terror regarding United Flight 553. That was the United airplane to get blackmailer Dorothy Hunt, where she and the entire plane load were killed, and her husband was a defendant in the Watergate case. 1973, Nixon and Murray Chotiner pardon and commute 500 crime syndicate people out of prison in one single year. Vice President Agnew resigned in disgrace in August of 73. In November 73, the White House tapes were erased by Rosemary Baby Scores again. That was Richard Nixon's secretary. January 72, a mail truck kills Murray Chotiner in front of in front of Edward Kennedy's house. That Murray Chotiner was the member of organized crime that discovered Nixon and Earl Warren. 1972, Howard Hughes, dope double dies. The real Hughes died in 67. And it was actually 1976 when the dope double was cashed in. July 1972, Nixon's hatchet man Charles Colson said, "If this nation is infiltrated the way I think it is, we haven't got a government." The chronology of murders and deaths of Gary Powers with his helicopter running out of gas, the U-2 pilot, the death of Hale Boggs, Lou Staples, the radio man in Dallas, Texas. This list of chronologies is of deaths and murders, of unsolved stories, the Jonestown scandal, the murder of the 30-day Pope who was deep sixth, so that the John Paul II could take over. Nelson Rockefeller gets the MKU and deep sixth, so forth, in control for Carter. All these things were going on with the team of Nixon and Ford up till the time and through Jimmy Carter's term. In the intelligence group were at work with these deaths and murders of politicians or important people. And when you total up, this is just a few of the names. There are literally hundreds of names of important people who had information about various government crimes. And when you total them all up, you have a stockpile of corruption, the kind of a decaying civilization that Robinson Jeffers spoke of. But the important point he made that I keep making is that if you don't acknowledge that these things happen, if you turn the other way, if you don't add them up, if you don't see it, and you can't acknowledge it, then you can't make this earth survive because it's on its way out, and you can't continue to live unless you acknowledge this part of your past. Speaking of acknowledging, I have had the book by Anthony Summers called Conspiracy, and a lot of people have asked me if I would talk about it or review the book when I get through with the series, or a great part of the next few weeks on Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. I will go into it. I think it's so disgusting. It's very difficult for me to read the book. I just look at the cover. I have a copy of it here for you. The cover of the book, Conspiracy. This is how Anthony Summers begins it. It is certainly possible that a renegade element in the U.S. intelligence manipulated Oswald. Whatever his role on November 22nd, 1963, that same element may have activated pawns in the anti-Castro movement and the mafia to murder the president. Now, just from that cover alone, he believes it's possible that a renegade element in the CIA or in the United States intelligence manipulated Oswald. You hardly recall Allen Dulles, the chief of the entire U.S. intelligence, the CIA, who formed from the OSS to the CIA, or John J. McCloy, or Lyndon Johnson, or Richard Russell from Georgia, or J. Edgar Hoover, or Richard Helms as renegades. They were the establishment intelligence operatives. There wasn't anything renegade about the manipulation of Oswald. The second clarification he has on his cover, Oswald, whatever his role. If Oswald didn't kill anybody, it would be impossible to have an entire Warren Commission with 552 witnesses and thousands of pages and 26 volumes of documents and evidence and blame it on a renegade group of anti-Castro Cubans. You would have to control the testimony of every witness who came before the commission, which they did. You would have to have a staff of CIA attorneys interrogating them, which they did. You had CIA secretaries transcribing the notes, which they did. And all the top government officials from the chief historian of the Pentagon on down were involved. There was no renegade group, and whatever his role should be clarified before you decide who did it. If Oswald didn't own the rifle, never saw the rifle, there's no physical proof he had it, then how could you possibly have a renegade element handling this assassination? And as far as pawns, he says there are pawns in the anti-Castro movement and the mafia to murder the president. The anti-Castro movement was the Central Intelligence Agency, and the mafia was the Central Intelligence Agency, wholly renegades. In the book, before he begins his story, which we will share and analyze together, he begins by acknowledging Mary Farrell of Texas and Paul Hawke of California for his work. Paul Hawke, last I heard him, works in the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory for the federal government, the Defense Department, and Mary Farrell works with the highest echelons of intelligence agencies with Bernard Fensterwald, Gordon Novell, the CIA, the Defense Department. When I was in Texas, Penn Jones said, "Don't visit Mary Farrell." he suggested she was an agent at the time, even though he uses some of her material and indexing for his newsletters. And then he thanked Sylvia Marr, who also wrote an index of subject index of the Warren Commission and left out all the Nazi connections, the Young Americans for Freedom, the Watergate connections that later showed up, the Douglas Caddy or Buckley. She left out of her bibliography and dictionary little reference book on the assassinations all the names of the people that worked with General Walker that came to Germany, that worked with the Hunt brothers and the Nazis, the Birch Society in New Orleans and in Texas, particularly Dallas, Fort Worth connections. The subject index that Sylvia Marr made, and I have done radio shows a long time ago, left out all of those important names, Volkmar Schmidt, Larry Schmidt, the people that were involved in the real hard work of the assassination were deleted from her book. And then he thanks Bernard Fensterwald, who has worked with the CIA all of his life and was James McCord's attorney at the time of Watergate. And Jeff Goldberg, he thanked, this is Summers thanking Jeff Goldberg of the AIB, that has now been recognized for what it is, a cover-up group, a renegade group itself of the intelligence community. And Jones Harris, who has always been a great admirer of J. Edgar Hoover, went into assassination work to defend the name of J. Edgar Hoover, his buddy, that's Jones Harris. So the people, she gives a few other people credit. I keep saying she, I think of Sylvia Marr. Actually, I'm talking about Anthony Summers now. Gives Dr. Vincent Grin appreciation for his help and indebted to him for the ballistic evidence. It was in the hearings of the House Select Committee that Dr. Grin used different bullet fragments for the testimony in 1978 than were used at the time of the assassination when the Warren Commission did their work in 1964. They were different weights, different sizes. They were talking about different bullets. So I will go at length into the story of conspiracy by Anthony Summers, but again, it goes back to what Robinson Jeffers talked about. If you don't acknowledge or know that these things are wrong and fake, that they are disinformation, they are historically inaccurate, they're covering up the real criminals, then you are bound to doom this situation in this country and let these people take over, and it will be very hard to survive on their terms. I do want to reiterate in the narcotic connections that the Kennedy assassination, as far as I'm concerned, November 22nd, 1963, was the most important date in American history for two particular reasons. And I've said them before, and I want to go into them again. When John Kennedy was murdered, it wasn't the first political assassination in the United States. It wasn't the first assassination in public or involved public leaders. It wasn't the first political assassination that was covered up. But it was the first murder of an elected president where every branch of the federal, state, local government was involved and could be proven to be involved. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the President of the United States, the new President, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Department and the Pentagon, Navy Intelligence, Army Intelligence, the Internal Revenue, the entire justice system, the prosecuting attorneys, the people that could have been prosecuted that weren't, the staff of lawyers on the Warren Commission, past president of the Bar Association like Leon Jaworski, every high echelon official could be proven to have either perjured himself or knowingly covered up the crime and been held and could be held today for this crime. Every institution of public trust that should have been trusted, these various agencies, was involved in the cover-up, if not involved in the actual murder, was involved in the cover-up. And the situation that made it so important was that this was the most obvious and first public use of the combination of the intelligence community with organized crime. This was the marriage of the mobsters killing the President of the United States, set up ever since as early as 1936, after Hitler was in power. Organized crime in this country that is extremely right-wing and conservative began to take hold and got stronger and stronger. And after Tom Dewey prosecuted Lucky Luciano in New York City, and then he went on to Italy. He was incorporated in the OSS, and as soon as the war was over, members of organized crime were working during the war at shipyards, and then they went into munitions industries. They supplied the vending machines for the Army bases. They supplied materials for military installations today. And the organized crime dope dealers, the syndicate, the mob, the hitmen, the forgers, the swindlers, the chairmen of brothels, the blackmailers, the dope dealers of all kinds, incorporated with the United States federal agencies and got so tangled that whether you call it the mob, the syndicate, the Cosa Nostra, whatever you want to call it, they got so entangled both into the military and into the political network of this country. They used each other. They had a common denominator, which was the Soviet Union. They had a common purpose of wiping out the opponents for the politicians or the witnesses to the trial or the witnesses to the Kennedy assassination or other assassinations. So they had a good thing going. One was allowed not to be prosecuted for drugs, prostitution, and various crimes that the syndicate does in exchange for being hitmen for the official politicians. And this statement can be proven over and over again in book after book that I have collected or which is available now that I haven't yet purchased. So that while the election year is going on at this time between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, there is more to whether they have the seat in the White House to run specific corporations or foreign policies. What is determined in the White House is that each of these men has a different turf, and they're protecting that geographic turf for the narcotic connections. And this is the reason there's so many narcotic deaths recently. It's the reason there's so many arrests recently and so many names linked to mob figures recently, because they're trying to bring each other down without the other one retaliating on them too hard. Now, just in brief generalities, if I break down the A team and the B team according to the politicians and then use some newspaper articles to cite what I mean, it might be a little clearer. These are just generalities, and they overlap, but they do have specific effects that can be proven in the daily news if you see it and read it carefully. One team, the A team, I call the West Coast team. It began with the aerospace industry, the building up of Lockheed, the use of, as I say, Murray Chotiner with Earl Warren and Richard Nixon's career. And this team has worked in Southeast Asia with Allen Dulles. They brought in from the Golden Triangle, or that triangle down there, cocaine, heroin, and so forth, out of Thailand, out of Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Allen Dulles was behind those operations. The Shah of Iran's sister was a dope dealer. The Shah was involved. The head of many governments got the spin-off and the profits from the narcotics traffic, and it was very lucrative for them, for their gunmen, to be reaping in millions from the narcotics traffic. And most of this narcotics from Southeast Asia was processed in Marseille, the Marseille connections, which just recently have combined with the Middle East connections in order to survive. In simplistic terms, this team has been close to Pepsi-Cola, where the Jimmy Carter Southern connections are to the Coca-Cola. At one time when Carter was in, they said the Coca-Cola team's in now instead of the Pepsi-Cola team. That's just a simplistic explanation. But one area of narcotic traffic that came in the corpses of GIs from Vietnam and Air America and the Flying Tigers and so forth, the Middle East narcotics was not big until the Shah was out. The Shah could keep a lid on the Middle East narcotics, and the Southeast Asian narcotic was linked heavily to the politicians in California, up and down California, and Nevada and Arizona, and that element. They had their strong connections in that Team A. Now, I'm going to take a break while we turn the cassette over. It is 30 minutes. Now, I'll go back to the Team B, the Carter connections in Georgia, and try to explain the drug war that's going on between these two teams at this time.
And now back to Mae Brussell and Dialogue. Well, actually, it's not Dialogue Conspiracy anymore. It's World Watchers International.
Yeah, we're World Watchers. When I started getting letters from overseas, and people overseas were getting tapes from different countries, and I thought it was time that we get on and become World Watchers. And besides that, we watch the world, and they watch us, so we have to watch them in order to survive. That's the name of the game, I suppose. Okay, now I'm on this side of the tape, side two, just in simplistic terms of the Atlanta, Georgia, and the Georgia connections to Jimmy Carter, down where the Coca-Cola companies are, and of course a common denominator between California and the Southwest, all through the Southwest, is the Defense Department. But when Jimmy Carter allowed or coaxed the Shah of Iran to depart from Iran, and he left and went his way, we saw a tremendous escalation in terms of narcotics from the Middle East, coming from Lebanon, Libya, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and through Iran, just pouring in, maybe 40 to 50% increase since 1978. And while Jimmy Carter served his oil lords very well by lifting the lid so that the profit of oils went up tremendously, he also served the Middle East connections and the narcotic connections. And in between the Southeast Asia and the Middle East connections, there is the South American connections of Colombia, Argentina, Bolivia, Costa Rica, and Mexico. Massive amounts of narcotics, hashish, marijuana, cocaine, coming two ways, one to California and the other into Florida. And I think the influx of the South American narcotics has increased tremendously, again linked to the Middle East, a great deal of it since Jimmy Carter was president. But this is something that Ronald Reagan can't use as a campaign issue because he is so closely linked to this other team that had control of the narcotics traffic before Jimmy Carter was president. There is a new book out by Robert Eringer on the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission called The Covert Power Groups of the West. Robert Eringer is that writer who had gone into, infiltrated the Klan, who had called me. He's from London. Pinnacle Books in London published his book, and he's the one that wanted to interview me about my research in our program, World Watchers. I've talked to him on the telephone to New Jersey, but didn't give out too much information. That's another story in itself. But the very common belief is that the power of the world in terms of money or banking exists through David Rockefeller. And in this book, on the Trilateral Commission, Eringer has a couple of sentences in there that support what I see as happening with the Carter administration. He said, this is a quotation, "It is interesting to note that during Carter's presidential campaign, the Georgia Mafia, Hamilton, Jordan, Jody Powell, and he mentions these other people, deeply distrusted Carter's involvement with Brzezinski, Rockefeller, and the Trilateral Commission, that even though they selected him as president, the Georgia Mafia was very suspicious of them. Carter whirled a full 180 degrees on the advice from his trilateralists in April of 1978 when he decided not to deploy the neutron bomb. Well, Carter also whirled 180 degrees away from the Rockefeller establishment, which he writes about in his book, The Bilderbergers and the Trilaterals. He betrayed them in terms of serving the mafia in the South, in Georgia, and the narcotics connections, and turned his back to that Team 80A that I was talking about that had control of the narcotics prior to Jimmy Carter coming into the White House. Specifically, he coaxed the Shah of Iran out. There's a long article this week in a book. It's written by Mr. Sullivan, the ambassador to Iran, William Sullivan, in a quotation. The United States, on the eve of the Shah's departure, was left without any policy. I overlooked the Brzezinski factor. They thought that Brzezinski could handle or make war or attack or control the foreign policy in Iran. But Carter had even more control than Brzezinski, and the flow of the narcotics from Iran just pours into New York, Germany, California, Washington, and all over the world at this point. This turnabout that Jimmy Carter made against the Trilateral Commission is not explained by anybody, and maybe I am the first person to do this and share this with you on the air and to study this thing out. Carter turned against the people, the Trilateralists or the Bilderbergers in certain respects. He eased the Shah out. He sent a representative there who told him to get out, and they would have a provisional government, and then it never came about. He eased out Somoza with his connections to these various drug characters and so forth around the world and got that dictator out of the country and sent him down to South America. His administration indicted Carlos Marcello, one of the largest mob bosses in the world, probably next to Meyer Lansky in influence. Carlos Marcello has been indicted on various charges in the Abscam story. He indicted Mr. Davidson, Irv Davidson, who's worked with the assassination team. Marcello has worked with the assassination teams, the teams that were with Nixon and Reagan throughout the rising of their careers. The Carter administration indicted Carlos Marcello, which is a dangerous thing to do. They indicted Irv Davidson, the public relations man who's threatened to blow this matter to the winds. They indicted a man in the Abscam story, this Representative John Murphy from New York, whose trial is going on at this time. I did a tape on Murphy last February, an article in the Village Voice by Jack Newfield. Murphy was linked to Thomas Gambino, the mafia leader, the Gambino narcotics gang. He was linked to Iranian oil and on the board of directors of the Shah's Foundation, the Pahlavi Foundation. He went to West Point with Somoza of Nicaragua and was close to Somoza, so that Murphy was indicted this year in the Abscam organized crime payoffs. His buddy from West Point, Somoza, was kicked out of Nicaragua. His buddy, the Shah, that he represented, the Pahlavi Foundation in Manhattan, was kicked out of Iran. These were courageous moves on the part of Jimmy Carter, but very subtle moves as a new team took over with this increase of the narcotics going on. He had the Amscab group under his Justice Department indicted Jenrette, who's now, I guess that case is ready to go to the jury. He was linked to organized crime and crime figures, and there are 80 to 90 more indictments or investigations going on, and each could bring in 3 to 4 or 10 arrests. The men indicted in Pennsylvania have already been given their charges and will probably go to jail. And Representative Williams, with his connections to New Jersey and the casinos and worldwide organized crime, he's under indictment. It took a lot of courage to do that, but only by getting rid of those people under his administration, Carter could clean the turf for other people that also his group had close links to. And I've done many hours on the Carter drug connections, and I'll do more. Now, I have mentioned the very sad fact, speaking of drug connections, about Stephen Reinhart. I did a tape last June on Reinhart. He's the chief of the Los Angeles Police Commission, and he was nominated to become a judge. The Senate Judiciary was to hear the nomination, and he was linked to Carlos Marcello and the mob and organized crime. And he was also linked to crime members. He comes from Los Angeles, the LAPD, and all of the police officials were rooting for his appointment. Daryl Gates, Evel Younger, who works with this California connection, were rooting to get Reinhart as a judgeship so that if any of their turf go before the courts, they would have Reinhart on the appeals court in California. Well, this week, Reinhart was approved as a U.S. judge. Stephen Reinhart, president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, was approved by the Senate to be a judge on the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. This judgeship was delayed, according to Los Angeles Times, because of unsubstantiated charges of organized crime by an informant. And our California Senator Cranston, of course, in quotes, was delighted by the approval. The California West Coast group are thrilled to have on the appeals court a man who worked with the Los Angeles Police Department at the time that Robert Kennedy was murdered, the time that Thane Caesar from Lockheed killed Robert Kennedy, at the time of investigation of Isla Vista or Ruben Salazar, any of the murders and counterintelligence people that would ever come up for appeal or murder charges. Reinhardt will now be the appeal judge, and he will move to San Francisco, the Ninth Judicial Court, where he's going to hear cases from California, Arizona, and Nevada, and Hawaii. Those are four of the largest drug connections in the United States linked to those Nixon-Reagan combines, and also Oregon and Washington, Montana, and Idaho. So that the new judge, the federal judge on the appeals court, will be a man, Stephen Reinhardt, who's been named by Joseph Hauser, an informant with the Abscam story. He had information about bribery and kickbacks and so forth. This man had been charged himself with that, but he would talk about political contributions to state candidates from members of crime figures that involved Reinhardt at time period 1973 at the height of Watergate and so forth. This man has made certain charges which should have been heard more seriously, but in an election year and with everything going the way it is, they didn't take a Senate vote person to person. It was simply a voice vote for something this important as an appeal court in California, and yay, yes, that's it. And so now we have Stephen Reinhardt on the appeals court. Very important to save all decisions you find in newspapers from now on, who gets the prosecutions and who gets released, because of the importance of people with even the suggestion of mob links being on the courts. But because there is a mob war at the very highest level geographically, if it's a $40 billion business, and that's probably a very modest figure, not including all the pornography and child prostitution and whatever the mob does, and extortion, blackmail, and so forth, a $40 billion figure in the United States. When you're fighting for that kind of turf, you have to have judges on a bench that let you out easy, and you have to have judges that lock up certain people who are willing to squeal or talk, and see that the system flows so that the maximum amount of crime people are back out on the streets operating again. They have so much money they put in the hands of the politicians that they're very important. They grease their palms and get just about everything they want. There's a wonderful book on Watergate, the story of Watergate, called The Breaking of a President. Many of you have it, some of you don't. And there's a story about the Nixon connection. But when you read about the Nixon connection compiled by Marvin Miller, you have to realize that there isn't a hair's breadth difference between Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. They're put in by the same people for the same purposes. And in this book, they have a list of the commuted sentences and the pardons that Richard Nixon did, and they have them year by year in alphabetical order. And the 500 people in the last year that Nixon let off that Charles Spears was talking about is exemplified in the indexing of the kind of people that were fully pardoned or commuted by Nixon in 1970. I'm not going to read you the whole list of things. April 17, 1970, pardons for people embezzlement of mail, stealing registered letters, larceny, illegal aliens, perjury, false statements to the VA, mail fraud, security, conspiracy to defraud, failure to supply information, forged securities, income tax evasion, narcotics, breaking and entering, furnishing false passports, furnishing false bank records, embezzlement of property, stolen cars, falsifying evidence of federal housing, mail fraud, securities, obscene letters, fraud in sale of securities, selling heroin, transporting securities, tampering with mail, false merchandise claims to the Army, embezzlement of bank funds, theft on government reservations, theft on government property. This book has a list of hundreds of crimes and pardons that Richard Nixon commuted, starting in 1969 with a man for an armed bank robbery that was commuted, and then 1970 escalating the pardons and letting these people out, you name it, every possible kind of crime. And then when they sell adulterated, misbranded coffee, they sell heroin, but it could be a $40 million heroin bust or $20 million, even the details there's not enough space for. So these kinds of pardons and commuting of sentences require judges on appeals courts or on the benches that either don't prosecute them in the first place or let them off in the second place. And it's very important to know that in this narcotic war, as it lines up, that when these men pressured to get this judge out here in California, they were protecting the Reagan team that's coming into power and were able to influence Carter to get this appointment to protect this team. Even though they fight with each other, there was pressure put on him, and goodness knows what kind of pressure that could be. The other article that's terribly important in the news this week that is equally disgusting as that appointment is the one about Frank Turple and George Corcola. When I came back on KLRB after a 2 years absence, I returned July 27th, and I gave a list of what I considered the most important news stories of that week and of the past 2 years that I had been off KLRB, even though I'd been making radio tapes for other stations. And number one story was the arrest of Frank Turple from Washington, D.C., with his links to Libya and CIA and gun running, narcotics, and Nazi, their links to the killing of the Jews at the Munich Games, and to the Carlos, the terrorist, and what passed off as left-wing terrorism was proved to be funded and supplied and trained by the CIA. Well, these guys, Turple and Corcola, were picked up in first of this year in New York City, December the 24th. They had 10,000 guns, and they were seized with $2 million machine gun sale. Members of the CIA and Corcola worked in New Jersey. He even supplied security for Exxon, Scotland Yards, and the Secret Service in the United States. They worked with an arms dealer in London, Mr. Samuel Cummings of the CIA. Frank Turple had an office in McLean, Virginia, and worked with Mitchell Werbel at the silencers and weapons for assassinations. Well, the men were supposed to go to trial, Turple and Corcola in New York, for these selling of these arms and weapons and possible murder charges linked to Libya. And Turple was also arrested in Washington, D.C. to go to trial with another person, Edwin Wilson of the CIA, who I said was involved with the CIA anti-Castro Cubans, with the Letelier murder, with the operation the Condor down in Chile, the assassination teams that are sent all over the world. These two men were very important people, Corcola and Turple, and then, of course, along with them, this Ed Wilson was an important person of the CIA who was to be in trial in Washington with Turple. Well, the New York Times had an article this week, not on the front page, not the front section or the second page, but section B, second section, page 3, three-sentence article, just titled Arms Selling Case. Two men accused of offering to sell guns to undercover agents posing as revolutionaries failed to appear at the start of their trial, and warrants were issued for their arrest. Frank Turple, 40 years of age, from McLean, Virginia, a former CIA man, and George Corcola, 38, who owns an industrial security firm in Nutley, New Jersey, were supposed to appear on the weapons charges. They have skipped their bail and gone out, I suppose, out of the country. The judge said we can try them in absentia, Judge Thomas Galligan, as if that's important to try these men in absentia. They're arming the left, they're arming the right, they're training the Libyan army to make war against Israel. They supply Idi Amin, they supply the terrorists over the world that are do bombing and killing. They worked with the CIA, and now they have left the country. The Washington Post had a small article the same date, McLean man fails to show for New York trial. And they mentioned that he had a trial coming up also in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, that he was running a training school in Libya for terrorists funded by the CIA, and he worked with another man from a California-based explosive firm, Jerome Brower of California, 60 years old, who was free on personal recognizance. Turple and Brower were to stand trial November the 5th. Turple has gone. The judge briefly mentioned that he's probably in Libya. That's the end of Turple. That's the end of Corcola. The links of the Central Intelligence Agency to the left-wing terrorists will probably never fully be developed because the men have been allowed on their own recognizance to the most important arrests in the United States in a long time to leave the country. There's another into some of these narcotic connections of the candidates. An article this week in the Los Angeles Times, 20 tons of pot on the FDR yacht. Many of you read about the arrest. It was a narcotic arrest of 20 tons valued at $40 million. And the important thing is it bore the banner of what they said was the Crippled Children's Society of America, which was a front for narcotics traffic all over the world. They used a yacht that was owned by Franklin Roosevelt when he met with Winston Churchill and so forth. This man bought it saying that he would make it a tourist attraction. It would belong to the archives of history, but he's been bringing narcotics and gun running, exchanging weapons and narcotics and flowing. The shipment brings in narcotics and takes back weapons to suppress people, labor organizations, groups that want to improve their way of life, to keep the terrorists killing any public officials that are in their way. There was a Cuban that was murdered, worked for the United Nations this week, who was gunned down by this Omega-7, the same group as Alpha 66 that works with Cortella and Turple. And they claim we're going to, after Saturday and Sunday, we'll start murdering more people from Cuba. There will not be trials. The terrorists, the CIA-linked, armed by Cummings and Turple and Corcola, will do like Brazil and have death squads and gun down whoever they want, and they have announced that they will. And meanwhile, Turpa and Coca-Cola have spread. But the Crippled Children's Society, that was the front, and they used charity fronts, reminds me of a tape that I did a while back in an article by Maxine Cheshire on the mysterious connections of John Ellsworth. These were the connections of false children's societies to Rosalyn Carter, and the use of a charity called City in the Schools, and a company that sold toys in New York City that was linked to organized crime and narcotics, prostitution, and International Children's Association. The Children's Organization has been a front for everything from Jim Jones' operation, where he took children from welfare families and took children away from their parents. But the gun smuggling narcotics operation is very common, and the front for it is this children's group, the International Children's Group that worked with, was photographed with Rosalyn Carter, and there were a lot of murders then that followed her meeting with these people. And John Ellsworth, who set them up, had worked with the Secret Service, the FBI, the Internal Revenue, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the CIA, and organized crime. Now, Ellsworth also worked in California. At Altamont, he was an agent provocateur. And what they've done is to make the Carters, Billy Carter, very visible with the narcotic connections in order to taint Jimmy Carter. They have supplied them overtly so that they're more visible. The Reagan agents are not seen sniffing coke or having marijuana or smoking in the presence of people. The aura of linking Jimmy Carter on the surface to the narcotics connections, like taking Billy Carter to Libya with a drug connection, or inviting him down, Irv Davidson, down to a yacht that Clint Murchison owned, and taking Billy Carter and touting around with these big wheelers and dealers such as Vesco is a new thing in order to bring down Jimmy Carter, while the strong operation is really engineered basically from California. California is a source of narcotics that keeps this state going very nicely. The politicians are very well greased with it. But there was another article I got from the San Luis Obispo paper on that county being a key drug port, and it goes into the name of a Mr. Bellamini, who had a rattan furniture company. George Bellamini and was chairman of it, and he was a confidant of Billy Carter, and introduced him to Libya, took him to Libya, and these people were arrested or linked to narcotic arrests, he and his partner, in 1978. And when they were in trouble with the law, then they linked onto the president's brother and take him on trips so that they themselves are not in the front of the narcotic arrest alone, and then that way they can get their prosecutions weakened because Billy and Hamilton, Jordan, and the various Carter people are in the news with the narcotic people. They had Rosalyn Carter with Gacy in Chicago, photographed with Jim Jones, with Ellsworth, with James Ippolito, and all these sleazy characters. They never set up Nancy Reagan with any narcotic connections. You never see her photographed with big dealers or organized crime or mobsters. But in order to discredit Jimmy Carter and embarrass him and to make him very visible, they've set him and his family surrounded by a team. But they're angry at Jimmy Carter, and this is one way to discredit him. But financially, Jimmy Carter has allowed the Middle East connection to increase its profits, and he's reduced the drug forces. He has to have teams or people that are in the pay of the drug connections. He's taken off the agents in Bolivia and Colombia. He has cut down the drug agents so that there's fewer people watching. The murders are rampant in the Florida and the islands down there in the West Indies. The drug witnesses are being killed. There are drug bombings. There are murders everywhere. And they are linked to the drug traffic, the drug war, basically, between these two candidates. And if you follow the drug exposures, the massive arrests at this time, they're very important because one group is trying to pin the narcotics traffic on the other and get them in to break their operation so that they can take over. There was a time when organized crime divided the United States into various sections at the Appalachian meeting in 1957. But the change of guard in the White House, when you change from Nixon and Agnew and a Jimmy Carter comes in, he changes that connecting the continuous flow of the contacts and brings in his own contacts. And it's necessary then to move Jimmy Carter out so they can continue their original flow. That $40 million a year profit goes into the hands of politicians. It goes into their pockets. It's important for their constituency. They build hotels, resorts. They bring in franchises and make the areas look very prosperous. And the politicians thrive on these kinds of businesses. They don't care who runs them or how they're operated. It makes their areas look like there's a lot of activity, industry, and high-price homes go up, the values escalate, and the mobsters have built them and inflated the prices, but they become choice real estate. The politicians are very vulnerable to the mob figures. They always have been, but it's more obvious now with the Carter administration and the Georgia Mafia and what the Middle Eastern turf has done as against the Southeast Asia. In other programs, I will clarify a little more the drug connection specifically of Ronald Reagan again, and then with Jimmy Carter, in case it isn't clear. But in the meantime, watch the articles on drug busts and arrests and realize it, from the White House on down, it's very important. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel. You take care and keep clipping those articles. Send them to me. Read them yourself. I'll be back with you next week on KLRB.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.